All right. Welcome back to another weekly update where I am hopefully keeping you 10 steps ahead of what's happening at the intersection of business, technology, and human experience. I'm your host, Christopher Lind, although that's pretty obvious from the podcast title. But all that said, I've got a rundown of 5 things that were at the top of mind for me this week. I'm looking forward to getting into these. Before I do, just again, thanks to every one of you who listens, who follows this, who sends along messages, sends along news articles that come across your desk. I really appreciate it and enjoy engaging with this community. It's a ton of fun, and I continue to hope that you find this valuable for you. And if you do, it would mean a ton to me if you would like, share, do all the social media things, tell your friends, whatever it is. It always helps me just reach a bigger audience and hopefully help more people. All right. So let's get into it. I've got 5 things, like I said. So I will try and be crisp and concise while at the same time addressing it holistically, because I've had some time to think about all this. And by the way, before I get into it, I have been alluding to the fact that aside from my layoff, there's some other interesting news developing that I will share. And I'm not sharing it this week, but most likely I will share it next week. So anyway, there's a little teaser for you to subscribe and follow next week. All right. Anyway, let's get into it. So the first one came. So a couple weeks ago, it's no secret. I've been very open about it. I've shared about the fact that my position was eliminated at ChenMed. Been going through kind of the whole grief cycle and just talking about my journey alongside with that. And so it was interesting because it just so happens someone had shared an article with me and said, "Hey, what do you think?" Because I know you've been open about your story. And if you have not seen this, Bloomberg did a very extensive article where they talked about the rise of layoff influencers. And it really wasn't about layoff influencers per se, so much as this whole concept and the change of where it used to be much more normal to not talk about, losing your job. And now it's becoming not only more popular, but almost commoditized. And it was a very, very interesting article, and it hit close to home for me, especially because here I am somebody who's been very open about my layoff experience and what that's been like. And so it was really interesting reading the article. And so I thought I would share some of my reflections on it because there were, as you can imagine, some very strong opinions on both sides of it. And interestingly, as usual, if you followed me for very long, you know that I tend to see value in where both sides are coming from. And I usually find myself somewhere in the middle with distinct perspectives on all of it, but with a little bit of nuance to the complexity. So I'll share it. And essentially what it really was getting at is being laid off, losing your job, culturally used to be a very shameful thing. You didn't talk about it. You didn't tell anybody. It was a secret. It was very embarrassing to share this with people. There was a stigma attached to you and all this stuff. And it talked about how now that culture is changing, and it addressed some of the complexity within that. But I think it didn't necessarily, I didn't think it addressed it appropriately, which I agree that there is something that is very difficult, and there's a reason why probably not everybody talks about difficult moments. And one of the things I very much agreed with some of the naysayers for the folks who are open about talking about layoffs, the ones who go, "That's terrible, you shouldn't do it." There was some genuine, respectful points that they made on that I agree with. And really the ones that I think is very much something that should be considered for anybody is, what really is the purpose behind this? And some of the examples that these naysayers highlighted was people who were literally commoditizing an emotionally traumatic moment and almost exploiting it for their own gain. Now, granted, I don't think it was fair how they painted it with a broad stroke brush that anybody who's talking about their layoff is trying to gain something from it. And I think they highlighted some real risks that people need to be aware of, that while we'd like to say society has moved forward, while we'd like to say things have changed, there still is very much a stigma attached to it. And I know because I'm an HR exec and I've been in the space long enough, I'm in lots of conversations with hiring managers. I hear all the things that are said, and people do have a perception of what they think about people. And usually it's an argument out of silence. And I think in some ways, that's where this whole concept of talking about your layoff, I think while I did it, I actually would encourage people to be very, very thoughtful and discerning before doing it. I really would. And so just because people may be like, well, Christopher, you talked very openly about the emotional journey you've been on. You've talked openly about the experience. You let people know, you didn't hide it. I did. Would I recommend that to everyone? I absolutely would not. And so if people were to have a private conversation with me, I would really want to understand their circumstances, their situation. I'd want to understand that, make sure they understood all the risks. I would want to make sure that if they are talking about it, they're representing it in a professional way that will not blow back on them in the future. And that they also just really realize what they're stepping into. Because for every person out there you hear who has a story of, I went on a tirade or I went on a sob story about my layoff and I got hired the next day because somebody heard for every one of those stories you hear, there's another story on the other side of a person who did it and now they can't find a job because they're permanently labeled as the unemployed person and, oh, something must be wrong with them. And so there's all this other stuff. So I think it's important to address some of the real inherent biases that we have about people who lose their jobs. And I think people who haven't lost their jobs really should take a moment to reflect on that and think about it. Whether you think people talking publicly about their experience or not is good or bad, I think if you haven't lost your job before, you really should check your biases and go, but what do I actually think about people like that? Would I second guess hiring someone if I knew they were out of work? Or would I genuinely want to assess them the same way I would anybody else and evaluate them, objectively? Because there is still a lot of bias. And while people are talking more about their layoff experiences, I can tell you right now, in every company I've ever been in or advised, there is still a ton of employment bias, tons of it. Candidates are chosen, we even private searches, it's like, oh, we don't want to find people who might be out of work. We'd rather find somebody who is gainfully employed, things like that. And so it's very much still a systemic problem that we have not overcome. So just because you see something like this and go, well, people are talking about it, so I guess culture's changed. I think there have been enough systemic problems in society that are now, we talk about it, but we know it's still a problem. And this is, again, an example of that, where just because people are talking about being laid off does not mean the stigmas don't go along with it, doesn't mean that people aren't discriminated against because of it. But I think what was really interesting about this article was it did, at least, I think overall, shine a positive light on the fact that, as a society, as people, we do need to be more willing to be okay with being open about hard times. And again, not everybody needs to do that, but we need to be okay with going, I'm struggling right now. I'm not okay. And here's why. Because it is very lonely. It is extremely lonely to go through something like a job loss in silence and to feel like you can't tell anyone. And, I can't let people know. And gosh, the length I know people go to try and fake still being currently employed because they're so ashamed and afraid of people finding out that they're out of a job. It's honestly debilitating. And so if you're someone who's like that, I do want to encourage you and let you know, I also talk to a lot of really great people out there who don't treat people that way. And I've seen really great success with people being more open about it. Now, I think every person, and I think this is the caution that I would give to everybody, is you need to go through that journey individually and determine what your comfort level is with being open. So one thing I will say, even though I'm open about things, if you read any of my stuff about losing my job, there is no circumstance, in my opinion, where it is okay to slander or just berate the organization or the people you worked with. It's just not appropriate. And it's a bad look and it sticks with you. And even if you get lots of likes and comments and, the people kind of patting you on the back going, yeah, good job for, bringing out the truth. If you do it with that intent and that comes through, doesn't matter how many likes or engagements you get, you are stigmatizing yourself. And that is a brand that will stick with you for a very long time. And you will make it very difficult to find new employment because nobody wants to hire somebody who just trash talks their last boss, their last company, their last group of coworkers. That doesn't mean you don't have to be honest, or in certain situations, you may be more open about what you dealt with. Not saying that that's necessarily wrong, but I personally, everybody who listens to me by now knows where I come from a worldview. And as a Christian, I firmly believe that, hey, not only is it not a good look on you, it's not good for your mental health and well-being. There's a reason the Bible tells us, like, hey, focus your mind on good things, on positive things. Like, think on these things, because when you don't and you start going down this path of trash talking and thinking about how horrible, you get sucked into it and you may not even see it, but the people around you do. And I've seen people who go down this path. They show up different in interviews. They're angry, they're frustrated. They don't bring the best version of themselves. So not airing all your frustrations isn't just about like, oh, protect your professional image. It's actually for your own good too. And so if you are going to be more open about it, be mindful of that. Be respectful, because honestly, there is a lot that you have to learn from the experience. If you really think about it, there are probably a lot of things you can be thankful for along the way. And if you focus on it more like that, and you do it as a way of showing support and allyship to other people who may be struggling, that's a very different flavor than I'm a disgruntled employee on a mission to just completely smear the place that I came from. So I think that's where there's a lot of caution. But I would also say, listen, I was very comfortable. So this is the second time I've been laid off. The first time I was much more quiet about it. Now, part of it was I was in a very different position than I am now. And so I was a little more concerned about the bias, the stigma associated with it. I was worried how people would judge me. I think I'm in a different place than I am today. I'm in a different place today than I was then. So I think some of that I've just shed and gone, okay, I'm not going to hide from this. But I think you may also be in a completely different place where that bias isn't going away, regardless of how well you represent the situation, no matter how positive you are, no matter how good you do. There are going to be people who think negatively of you and who stigmatize you. And if you're in a place where you are not emotionally or psychologically ready to carry that burden, and it'll be too much for you, I think there is nothing wrong with being private about it and saying, no, I'm not going to be open. I'm not going to tell everybody about it. And I'm okay with that. I just think don't do it because you're ashamed and you feel guilty. Do it because you go, you know what? I just personally am not in a place where either one, I feel like I can represent it in a productive way, or two, I'm just not in a position where any bias that may come with it, I'm really in a position to overcome that or feel comfortable with it. And that's where, again, I wouldn't just tell everybody, you know what, if you get laid off, go out there, make a post, tell everybody, tell the whole world. I think that'd be foolish. And I have talked to a number of people who have been inspired by some of the stuff I've done, and they've said it's helped me be more open about it. I've talked to other people who said, I was inspired by your openness. Here's where I am, and I don't know that I'm quite ready. And I've said, good on you. Good on you for going through that process of evaluating it, thinking about it, weighing the risk, weighing the concerns, and going, here's ultimately where I land. I'm not going to hide, but I also am not going to be super public about it. Okay, good. And so I thought it was a really interesting article. And honestly, it overall was well balanced. And I don't, again, like so many things, there's not a simple answer. Is it bad to post about your layoff experience? No. Can you do it really poorly? Yeah. Is it good to do it? Not necessarily. To the people I've seen who I know are exploiting the experience for their own gain, I don't think that's cool either, because there are people who have been completely traumatized by their layoff experience. And it is, if you look it up, it's like one of the most significantly emotional, traumatic experiences in a person's life. And so to just exploit that for your own gain, you're not showing any sensitivity to people who may not be able to do that and may be struggling with it. And again, if you're doing it wrong, you may be perpetuating some of the biases that are actually making it harder for other people who are laid off and can't hide it or can't exploit it for their own gain. And so I think just being mindful of that, really objectively weighing your heart and saying, how am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Is it really for a greater good or is it not? And that's a personal decision. But again, I think the article did a good job of weighing both sides of it. And I would encourage everybody to read it to at least see, okay, there's different perspectives regardless of what side you landed on. Okay, so enough on that one. So the next one I thought was really, really interesting because we're in this age of, AI. Well, actually, I'm going to flip flop. Here we go. I'm on the fly. I'm going to flip flop. So I'm going to jump to the next one, which is the Starbucks CEO. And then I'm going to come back to this other one. The Starbucks CEO is taking some major heat, which is funny because when he first got the job, he was like, it was all positive news. It was heralded. It was great. Everybody was so excited. It was going to be great. And then what came out was, as part of his employment agreement, he negotiated using a private jet to fly him to work, which is 1,000 miles each way. That was part of his deal. He lives in California, Seattle, all this stuff, which suddenly turned the social perception of him. He went from this, it's going to be amazing, he's great, everybody's happy about it, to he is the biggest villain on the planet right now and the epitome of all things that are, corporate executives that people dislike. And like always, I have very mixed, complicated feelings about this. So I will say this, my list of the areas where I'm like, I think he might be taking more heat than is necessary is much shorter than where I think, the list of things. But let me represent the positive side of this first. It's very easy to throw stones and say that's insane. Like, I can't believe this. It's so horrible, all this other stuff. Why doesn't everybody get all that? All this other stuff. And it's like, I am all about equity, but equity is not the same as equality. And so is the way the CEO's lifestyle, his compensation is that going to look very different than it is for Starbucks barista or even somebody in corporate and middle management or things like, yes. And do I think that's inherently just by default wrong? No. And that may make some people very angry, and that's okay. But I think there is a level of risk that comes with being the CEO. There is a level of just stress and stuff that comes along with it, a level of, honestly, isolation. I tell people all the time, the higher up you move, the lonelier it is. You have no friends. You cannot trust anybody. I was talking with somebody the other day about some of my experiences, and they're just like, oh my gosh, like you literally feel like you're constantly watching over your shoulder. So to me, there's a degree that comes with that goes, should it be compensated differently? I think it should. Should it come with perks that maybe not everybody else experiences? Yeah, and I'm okay with that. I don't think a CEO should make the same as everybody else in the company. Do I think taking a private jet back and forth to work is a good thing? No, for a lot of reasons. The carbon emissions in and of itself, it's like a private jet puts out 8.2 cubic tons of CO2 in an hour. A person does that in a year, does 2 in a year. It does 8 per hour. So this private jet back and forth for one person, to me, is just like gross. Like, what are you doing? Like, this isn't good for anybody. So I don't like it for that reason. I also, rather than just poking at the jet thing though, I just literally go, so you want to live in California? So Starbucks is in Seattle. What is wrong with us that we think for a job like this, you have to be in proximity to the office for X number of hours per week. I just still do not understand that. And so I think there's a problem underneath this that's even bigger that nobody's addressing. And they're just like, well, should he take he should fly commercial. I'm like, we're arguing over whether you should take a private jet or fly commercial. How about we just address, does the CEO really need to fly to Seattle to be at the office like this frequently? Let's talk about that problem and maybe address that problem and maybe change the idea that you reach a certain point in your career that somehow you have an aura about you that can only be experienced in the physical. Like, give me a break. It's not true. I ran I've ran global teams at the senior most level. I ran my entire time, almost 4 years at Chenman. I never once traveled to Florida. I never once met a single one of my coworkers. And yet we had some of the closest relationships I've had in my professional career. This idea that it can't be done, I think, is at the root of this problem, or it's definitely one of the issues at the root of it. I will firmly agree that I think it is almost just gross disregard for how different of an experience a CEO has versus the everyday thing. And when you look at Starbucks policy for corporate employees, like they require their employees to be in the office 3 days a week. So in some ways you're like, well, I mean, I guess they're being consistent, like the CEO has to too. So I guess that means a private jet. But again, it goes back to like, hang on a second. Like, why are we so hung up on this proximity thing? If we address that, we might actually address this whole private jet issue in and of itself, because let's see, if the CEO doesn't have to fly to Washington every week, possibly multiple times a week, he probably wouldn't even care about a private jet in the first place. And then maybe suddenly flying first class on corporate, whatever, commercial jets isn't a big deal. And, okay, fine. Like that I just don't get. But I do think, and one of the things I will say I see a lot at executive levels, and if there are any senior leaders listening to this, this would be something that I think you should seriously consider. I think it very much illustrates the just complete disparity between the executive lifestyle and the average employee lifestyle, and how dangerous it can be to have someone who doesn't think twice about taking a corporate jet to and from, Washington from California multiple times a week, like it's no big deal, to somebody who might be trying to figure out, like, how do I even find a babysitter to watch my kids after school because I can't get out of the office to come pick them up. Like, the kinds of problems he's dealing with are vastly different. And I see this play out all the time where decisions are made at the C-suite level with little to no consideration for the implications of those on real working people who, and I'm not saying the CEO doesn't work, I'm just saying his work experience is so vastly different that you end up making decisions based on, well, if this is what it's like for me, like, why can't everybody else do this? And you don't realize that what you're asking your employees to do is not the same thing at all. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens with this. My guess is this one's probably going to be one that just kind of blows by. Maybe there will be a public, oh, he's not going to take the, corporate jet anymore. He'll take chartered flights, whatever. There will likely be some thing, but I think it does speak to some bigger problems that we have. And like I said, I think to senior leaders, I'm not suggesting that your compensation, your work environment should feel and look exactly like everybody else's. It's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is you should be doing things to actively stay connected to your employees so that at least you're not doing things like this that are just a blatant, sticking your nose up at your general employees. And so that when you're making decisions, you're actually truly taking into consideration the way it affects your employees. I know for me, in every role I've been at, I have made a point to have virtual coffees with people at all levels of the organization, just to stay connected with them, to talk to them about what their experience is like. What are the things they're struggling with? How are they doing? What are some of the challenges that they're facing, and what might be things? That kind of stuff helps you stay connected. And this to me was just one of those, like, well, I guess this is what happens when that doesn't happen. Now, who knows? Maybe he'll go on and he'll be completely different, and this will be a lesson. I can certainly hope and wish that that is the case. But I have a sneaking suspicion that probably won't. But we'll see. I'll be interested to follow and see how everybody responds to it. All right. So the next three are AI related, and it's interesting seeing some very different perspectives on all over the spectrum. So there's three different ones that I'm representing today. So the first one is companies are seeing AI as a growing threat, which is really interesting. A company called Arise did a pretty comprehensive study of Fortune 500 companies, and they analyzed all of their annual statements. They analyzed their quarterly earnings reports, all this stuff, and they were looking at it, and they started noticing that AI is now popping up on these things on a regular basis. In fact, a 473.5% increase. It's now showing up like left and right. AI is on the corporate agenda. It's on the corporate risk list. It's all this stuff. And 281 of the Fortune 500 companies actually cite AI as a serious risk that they're considering. And so it's interesting that despite its popularity, despite its notoriety, despite the hype, if you listened last week, I talked a little bit about, is the bubble bursting? And I don't necessarily know that the bubble is bursting. I think some of the hype cycle is dying down, and we're starting to see things for what they really are. And this to me is an example of this. The companies are starting to go, we know it's here, but we're actually a little bit nervous about it. What was really interesting to me, though, was out of all the people they talked to, only 30% actually said they see any benefit to generative AI. They are not considering it as a benefit, which to me also shows one of what I believe is the biggest risks to companies right now is they are seeing AI as a risk, which is a good thing. At least now they're seeing it as a risk, which I think can be good. But what I think they're missing is how much opportunity it actually brings. And that, to me, is really a statement on the fact that organizations don't really fully understand what they're playing with. And I continue to see mistake after mistake after mistake as companies really try and go after some of this stuff, and they don't really know what they're doing. And then it ends up on the risk list because they're like, yeah, we tried it and it didn't go well. And they're actually missing all these really incredible opportunities to do some really awesome stuff. And I think that's disappointing, seeing some of this research that, again, part of me was encouraged that more companies are recognizing the risks, but I'm actually almost more concerned that it's starting to swing too far to the point where companies are going, like, now we're almost too concerned about it. And I think the companies, to senior business leaders and founders and, CEOs who watch and listen to this, I would warn you, don't think that it's too much of a risk that you don't at least objectively examine and explore where it could play a role in your organization, and do it the right way. Yes, because there are risks, but do it the right way, because what is going to happen is if you say, nah, it's too much of a risk, we're not touching it, someone else who doesn't and who does do it the right way is going to come eat your lunch. And I will stand behind that statement, that anybody who just goes, nah, too big of a risk, we're not touching it, at some point, somebody's going to come eat your lunch, because there is tremendous benefits to AI when used properly, and ignoring it is not the right answer. I think approaching it wisely, approaching it with discernment, approaching it with time and pace and resources. Yeah, those are the ways that you do it correctly, but ignoring it, that's going to come back to bite you. So it was really interesting seeing this. Now, granted, the report, I always give a little context to the report. It comes from a company that builds custom large language models for companies. They do custom proprietary stuff. So, of course, the sales angle to it is, oh, look how many companies are scared and they're doing it wrong and all this, like, buy our LLM, buy our AI, and it'll be all good. And I at least always call attention to that, because you can read it in the report. You can definitely read how the data is being positioned to say, look how big and scary this is. Your solution is us. Which underneath it, I agree with the premise of what they're saying, is there are some very legitimate risks. Companies are making big mistakes with this. So you need to approach it with discernment and maximize the benefits, because not enough people are seeing the real benefits. That I agree with. What I get nervous about is like, well, I couldn't see the questions that were asked. I couldn't see the way they were positioned it. I couldn't see the actual data to go, was there some inherent bias to this? But I think the overall general consensus of the report, I agree with. Does having a rise build your AI fix it for you? No, because to me, quite honest, the tech is the least of the problems. In every instance I've ever dealt with massive digital transformations, the tech is almost never the real problem that blows things up. It's a factor. It contributes to things, but it's almost never the number one factor. So there's that one. Now, here's kind of some polar ends with this. So then you've got the CEO of Procreate, James Kuda, and he came out and he made some very bold public statements that I hate generative AI. I don't like it one bit. I don't see any value in it. And we as a company are committed to never using generative AI or AI in our products. Now, if you don't know what Procreate is, it's an iPad app that is used for drawing, artistic stuff, animation, stuff like that. And so they're saying, no, we're seeing all this Gen AI garbage that's filling the internet. We think it's trash. I hate it. I think true art comes from the creative human spark. It comes from hard work. It comes from all this other stuff. So that's his position. But what's interesting about it is, and this is where I don't like these like extremist headlines, because you can't stay consistent with it. So I happened to do a little bit of research into him, was even looking at some of his Twitter accounts and stuff like this. And he got some reasonable pushback where people were like, you're not going to do anything with AI. Like, you literally believe everything an artist does is creative and beautiful and wonderful and should be done manually. Like, what about removing backgrounds? You're not going to use AI for removing backgrounds. What about, auto blurs or thing like you're not going to do anything? And suddenly the I hate it, we're never going to do it started to fade. And it was like, well, there are certain areas that we see back. And I'm like, see, this is the inconsistency that I see so often. And I think what I really wanted to call out in this one in particular is statements like this and positions like this, where this actually starts to show some of our own inherent bias, that what we do is actually really important and only a human should be able to do it. Things like that others do, well, that's fine for AI. Things that we deem beneath us, it's okay for AI to do. And I'd be curious if I sat down with James, I'd love to ask him, so are you fine with like Amazon not using AI then too? You hate AI, you think nobody should use it. Are you fine with Amazon not using AI? Are you fine with your products not showing up, for whatever? Are you fine with your daily life prices going up because they can't contain costs because they can't find workers and rest? I mean, you start going, and then all of a sudden you start to see people unravel and go, wow, I mean, that's different. Like why is it different? Is it different because you don't do it and you don't inherently value those things? And so things that you don't inherently value, you think you can hand off to the machines. Well, somebody else does inherently value that. And they think there's a unique gift and skill that they bring to doing that thing that you have deemed insufficient, inadequate, worthy of AI. And I think this is something that we have to be really, really, really careful of, because this kind of us-them attitude, it's subtle, but I see it creep in all these different areas. And this AI is really starting to bring it out of people in a lot of different ways, where it's like, oh, I'm either really for AI and I'm using that as an excuse to wipe out people's jobs because what they do isn't really all that important. And it's like, did you decide that because it's not actually that, it actually is very robotic? Or did you decide it because you think it's beneath you or it's not important to you because you don't understand it? And so again, it very much came out when you actually started doing some digging into what is his actual view on this. And what I started to see from it was his actual view is he doesn't like AI for things he doesn't see as a priority. He does like it for things that, aren't worthy of artistic flair or whatever. And you could see some of these examples. And that would just be my caution to people is be very careful. Now, that said, those of you who follow me, I'm a big advocate of AI. And I think there are different unique circumstances where you might go, hey, I personally don't value this, but I also would never hire somebody to do this type of a thing. And the example I've used in the past was I use generative AI to create some of my YouTube thumbnails. Why? Well, because I'm not a graphic designer and I don't have the skill set or the talent to create that kind of artistic flair, but I have something in my head that I want to see. Now, somebody could say, well, you should have a person do it. I can't afford to have a person do something for something that I don't charge any money or make any money from. If there's any graphic designers or folks out there who go, out of the goodness of my heart, I would just love to create your thumbnail art for you. Okay, send me a message. I'm happy to do that. But I personally would not prioritize that is a service that I would pay for anyway. And so for me, AI, okay, do it. But I would never go on the market and say, we don't need artists and graphic designers anymore. Because I go, well, no, there are certain circumstances where it doesn't make sense. And I get he's in a very difficult position because he's catering to an audience that is artistic, that cares deeply about creativity and the artistic work they do. And so I think it's a smart move by him to say, hey, we're making the conscious choice not to integrate AI into our products. I think he'd be wiser in saying, we're going to be very strategic and surgical about where we implement AI because we see the value in creatives learning skills. We see the value in them developing these skills. And we actually want to encourage that. And we don't ever want AI to take away from the creativity. I think there's a way he can do it without going, I hate AI. We're never going to use it. And then within minutes have to backpedal and go, well, actually, except here and except in these, to me, I'm like, come on, James, you could have done better than that. But I think it's a real risk that we all need to be really mindful of because we can all find ourselves there. And it, again, goes back to this, I hate AI except for the things that I don't value and I'm just want my way. And then AI can do it. And I don't really care about the implications that has on other people. And so I would encourage everybody just to be mindful and cautious about that. Now, flip side, but not quite the flip side. Just be so careful when you read headlines. Please, please, anybody watching, listening, do not share, do not engage with, do not spread information based on what you read in a headline, because I cannot tell you the number of things I read every week. And I read the headline and go, interesting. And then 3 sentences in, you're like, that's not exactly at all what is being said here. So, clickbait headline, Amazon CEO says developer jobs, they're going to be gone to AI in 2 years. I mean, I'm sure that grabbed lots of computer professionals' attentions, especially if you worked at Amazon. So what the truth of this story is, and I actually, as I read it further, I went, well, I would never create a headline that says all these jobs are going to be gone in 2 years. I wouldn't be comfortable with somebody writing an article saying I said that, because I'd be like, that's not what I said. Clearly, they did. And so Matt Garman, who is actually not the CEO of Amazon, so already we're off here. He's the head of Amazon Web Services. So a portion of Amazon, specifically their web services, where all their technical, housing, cloud service stuff is done. So anyway, even he does not say developer jobs are gone. When you actually start digging into it, what he says is developers will not be coding, because writing code is writing computer language that computers are going to be better at writing computer language than people. And so he goes so far as to say, so I don't think any developers are going to be writing any code in the next 2 years. My personal take on this, and I'll probably talk about it more next week, because I'm seeing a lot of things happening, even in my own experience, where I actually think AI is getting worse. And I'll explain why next week. I don't have time today, but I think he might end up eating his words on this for a couple reasons. First of all, one, There's just so much problem solving and critical thinking that goes into coding it's more than just writing code. Just like you might be able to write words, but you might suck at writing a book because there's more than just putting words on a page to writing a good book. And I think the same is true with code. Just because you can write code doesn't mean you can do it well. So I think, first of all, one, I think he's missing some things, which doesn't surprise me necessarily. He's the head of Amazon Web Services. It's probably been a long time since he's actually physically written code. And so, like I talked about with the Starbucks CEO, the distance starts to separate. The higher up you go, you start to forget what really goes into it. And pretty soon you go, yeah, we don't need people for that. We've written every code that could be written. What do we need people to think about that? But that's not a fair representation of him, by the way, because that's not actually even what he's saying. But I think he's missing the target on that. I think he's completely missing the target. I think he has forgotten what really beautiful code is, and it's about more than hashtags and booleans and variables, and it's more than if then statements. There's an art to it. And so I think the rote robotic part of code, I completely agree with him. I think we might be there. We might be pretty close to that now. I don't think we need 2 years to get to that point. I think the actual robotic portion of it, yes. I think the artistic, creative part of it, no. But I think even he acknowledges that because he's like, I don't think they'll be spending their time coding. Now, again, I think he's a little too far in saying they won't be at all. I think there still will be some element of a software engineer's job where they will be doing some routine coding, but I think it's going to look very different, which obviously, if I could sit down with Matt, I would have this conversation, and I have a sneaking suspicion we'd probably be more aligned on this than the article represented him as. But I think he's more on the camp of, yeah, AI can do this. 2 years from now, we're not even going to need people writing code. But what he's not saying is developer jobs are gone. And I think that was the gross misrepresentation that really stood out to me, was the fact that he didn't say developer jobs are gone. He literally just said they are going to radically change, and that developers are going to need to change their skill sets and how they spend their time and what they prioritize in terms of being successful in their job. Which if that's really what he's saying, I agree with every single aspect of that. And I don't think that's just developers. I think that's true of literally every professional on the planet, that technology advancement in certain things is changing things radically. And if you just go, this is how I've done it, this is how I've always done it, I'm not changing it, I don't care what's happening, I'm just going to keep doing it, and I expect that I'm going to be fine. You are not. You are not. And that, what he's getting at specific to developers, I actually think he is spot on. Now, the question is, my question back would be, so Matt, what are you doing to help prepare your developers for this change? What are you doing to strategically show them how AI is going to play a role and what that future looks like of being a developer here? And what things are you putting in place to upskill and prepare and support them through that transition? Because if the answer is, well, that's not my problem, well, then I would say, I don't know what business you have being a senior leader over this group of people, because that is your job. That is your concern. If you already know that AI is radically changing this, and in my prediction, 2 years, I'm pretending him, like in 2 years, this is going to radically change, and what they're doing today, they won't need to do. Well, then as the CEO whose sole job is to be thinking 3, 5, 7, 10 years ahead and making plans and pushing your teams to be driving for that, I hope that's on the top of your agenda then, and not just something that, you're stating in interviews, that is then being picked up and slated as this is the end of developer jobs. But like I said, going into it, I think it was not an accurate representation. And most likely, I think there would be a lot more things that we would be aligned to than not. And so truly, I'll conclude by saying, hey, everybody, literally, I don't care what your job is, because everybody has that same bias that the Procreate CEO has. What I do is so unique and different and magical and artistic and creative. What I do is so that there's no way it could ever be done by a machine or it could ever be done by someone else. And the reality is it can. And that's where you are responsible for staying on your toes, keeping your game up, always sharpening your skills, looking to build what's next. And yeah, does your company have a responsibility to help you with that? Sure. But you can't sit back and go, well, I'm just going to kick it back and wait for them to take care of it, because they won't. The sad news is they won't. As much as they may try, they won't. And even the companies I know that really do their best, it's an impossible game to win. It really is. Even the companies that are pouring as much as they humanly can into the development of their talent. The reality is, with the pace things are moving, you can't do it alone. And so it has to be a team partnership between employees and employers going, okay, here's the future. This is what this looks like. How do we lock arms together and move forward? So with that, I hope this was helpful. Hope it made you think. Hopefully it challenged some of your inherent biases, because we've all got them. I guarantee everybody you watching, listening, you've got that thing that you go, 100%. Nobody can do this quite like I can. And there's a percentage of it. Somebody could, or something could. And are you always being objective about what that is so that you can stay ahead of the curve? And with that, I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your Friday, wonderful weekend, and we will see you on the other side.